How's it going? Hope the end of the week. I already fucked it up. 2021 was better, right? Like, we got the jab, things returned to a slightly more similar sense of normality. In terms of my channel, though, I mean, I put out a lot of stuff that I'm very proud of, so thank you guys for sticking with me all throughout this year, even through the month or so that would come up every now and again of no content. I figured I'd do something a little bit different in addition to my normal best of streams 2021 video that I normally do. I don't know, I played so many great games this year that I felt like I wanted to talk about them in a more kind of formal setting. These aren't just games that were released in 2021 because I actually went back to a bunch of older games from previous years, previous decades, and tried them out, and I found a lot to love. So I didn't really know how to title this video to reflect that, because if I say like favorite games of 2021, people would think that I'm just talking about games that released this year. I don't fucking know. We're gonna deal with what we have. So this year I've put together a list of my top 9 favorite games that I played, roughly in order. If you're wondering why there's not 10, it's just because there's a game that should be on the list, but isn't. If you know anything about me, you know how excited I was for Halo Infinite. As of the time of recording this video, it's currently in a multiplayer beta. The campaign has not released yet. It comes out in a few days from now, I believe. So it wouldn't feel right to give an opinion on the entire game without having played all of it. That game will probably end up getting its own video in the future of just me talking about it, because I've got a lot of loaded thoughts about what I've played so far. Most of them good, some of them not so good. So look forward to that in 2022, I guess. With that said, here are my top 9 favorite games that I played in 2021. My patience for turn-based RPGs has seriously diminished over the years. I can barely stand the thought of going back to play one of the older Pokemon games, and that's just because I grew up with them. Random encounters, tedious grinding for morsels of experience points, uninvolved gameplay, these are conventions that have existed since the 80s and 90s, but none of them strike me as being particularly fun. That being said, when an RPG can streamline or find creative ways around these conventions, it really grabs my attention, and luckily, Deltarune Chapter 2 fits this criteria. I played its predecessor Undertale back when it was super fresh, before the idea of the game having multiple paths was even well known, and way before the Pope got his hands on it. It was very endearing, with expressive sprites and great music and a creative battle system that keeps the player involved through timed button presses and bullet hell sections to dodge damage. Deltarune was released a few years later by the same creator, and it just did everything Undertale did but better. Lots of charming characters, clever writing, graphics and music that are an entire generation ahead of its predecessor. It really is a fantastic indie game that you can tell has a lot of heart put into it. Hopefully the next chapter comes out before I'm dead. I love Kirby so fucking much, man. If there's a Nintendo franchise I want to see break into the tier of Mario and Zelda in terms of sales, it's Kirby. But I don't think that's ever gonna happen. Oh, fuck! I am such an idiot. Awesome! Oh my god, fuck yes, this looks so fucking good. This looks fucking awesome. Nintendo, please do not fuck this up for me. If we jump back 20 years, however, we find ourselves at Kirby 64, which is Kirby's first 3D game. No, not like that, smartass. The core Kirby gameplay is intact, swallowing enemies, gaining their abilities, fighting bleeding eyeballs, but these central ideas are expanded upon in interesting ways here. You can now combine 2 abilities to create new combinations. Put together fire and cutter, you get a flaming sword. Combine ice and electricity, you become a fridge that spawns food for you. Mixing and matching is a lot of fun, and you keep finding new combinations hours into the game, which is funny, because the game's only a few hours long. My only major complaint is that to pad out this length, the game forces you to collect every crystal shard in the game, otherwise you get a bad ending. I don't know how unpopular of an opinion this is, but punishing the player for not 100%ing your game is pretty dumb. Completing a game 100% should be something you do out of love for it, not out of a sense of obligation, and it can get pretty frustrating when you need to bring abilities from entirely separate levels to find some of these crystal shards. Plus you can lose those abilities in one hit, so I don't know, it gets really fucking frustrating. The final boss is a pretty sweet reward for it, though. Guilty Gear Strive may be the best traditional fighting game I've played in a very long time. It's very accessible to newcomers, but also has enough depth where I find it consistently interesting to watch and think about. Every character plays incredibly differently, and learning a new character is always a fun challenge. The game plays really well online, the art style and music are amazing and really define this game's personality as being incredibly over the top while also very well refined. However, just like every other fighting game, if you're not into the whole online multiplayer thing, I can't give it a super strong recommendation. The story mode is essentially a 4-hour cutscene, and I watched it. I kind of sort of wish I didn't. I mean, it wasn't egregious or anything, I just probably should have watched like a movie instead or something. The arcade mode is serviceable enough. It's got a fucking ridiculous true final boss though. And the training mode is pretty great, but again, if you don't have that competitive itch that needs scratching, this probably isn't the game for you. If you have even a moderate interest in fighting games and that whole community though, I'd honestly say this is one of the best places to start if you're unsure.
It's the Grand Champion!
I'll be honest, it's very hard for me to separate this game from the jokes that surround it. I'm just now playing this game 15 years after its release, so it's difficult to ignore the many ways in which it is dated. The amount of voice actors is extremely limited. Most NPCs share a voice with at least a dozen others. The graphics are pretty old by today's standards, and the facial animations are fucking hilarious. With that being said, for every way this game comes up short relative to more modern RPGs, it has at least 3 times as many ways in which it impressed me and set the stage for games to come in the future. The world of Cyrodiil isn't exactly beautiful, but it's chock full of places to explore and quests to complete. So many of these side quests have interesting premises behind them and see you traveling to all manners of weird locales, and it's much better than the quests in Skyrim, which can pretty much be reduced to go to place, kill person or monster, return for reward. The magic system here is also very interesting. Not only can you cast basic offensive spells like lightning, fire, and ice, but you can inflict unique status effects on your opponent, such as reducing their physical strength so much that their weapons and armor weigh them down to the point where they can't even move. The character creation process is very in-depth and prioritizes planning and sticking to your guns. You're forced to choose only a few specific skills to specialize in, and progressing in only those specific skills will give you experience to level up. This might seem like more of a limitation, but it really enhances the replayability of the game. You can play the entirety of the story with just a sword and shield and not learn a single spell. Want to play it again? Alright, let's focus on learning summoning magic so you don't even have to do any of the fighting yourself. It may be less streamlined and definitely a lot uglier than Skyrim, but it makes up for it by the absolute depth of customization and creativity packed into the gameplay. I mean, it also goes on sale for like $5, so if you're looking to lose hours of your life for cheap, you know where to look. I'm very new to the Metroid franchise, which is a bit odd considering the thematic similarities with Halo, but I'm very happy to announce that this game has made a fan out of me. From the very beginning, this game does a great job portraying Samus as a badass. You not only see it in the cutscenes, but you feel it in the gameplay. The melee counter is one of my favorite features. It's powerful and looks awesome, but the timing element makes it so you can't rely on it as a crutch for every situation. The slide, the flash shift, the shine spark, the ball buster, all of these tools in Samus's arsenal make the game feel so smooth and responsive. It's tough, but fair, especially for those not used to this sort of game. Every victory I had felt earned, and every loss I suffered felt deserved. It probably warrants mentioning that I also beat Super Metroid this year, but to be completely honest, Metroid Dread just blows it out of the water. I do miss some of the music from Super Metroid, but in terms of graphics, gameplay, and overall sound design, Dread just does so much more for me. I know that'll probably put me on some people's naughty list, but as someone who doesn't have nostalgia for Super Metroid, I can't ignore the ways in which it is outdone here. Yeah, we're not done with Metroid yet. Somehow changing the series to first person and opening up the environments into 3 dimensions creates a greater sense of immersion and atmosphere when it's done right. Who would have fucking guessed? When people say that Metroid is a series with heavy emphasis on atmosphere, this is by far the best example in my experience. The music, art direction, and creature design all paint a picture of a world that is beautiful and mysterious, but unmistakably hostile. Everywhere you go, you see remnants of a society long gone. The scan visor is also one of my favorite things in this game, and possibly any game. Every enemy and item has its own description and morphology that you can check out if you feel so inclined, and it really makes these creatures feel real. The only real complaint I have is that the controls on the GameCube version are a bit cumbersome. I can't blame Nintendo or Retro Studios for it really, since shooter controls just hadn't been established at this point in time, but not being able to use the C-stick to control the camera is pretty unintuitive. Still though, it's a great game that I recommend for anyone who likes Halo or Half-Life or even just video games in general. I love piracy. Sea of Thieves, baby. What an unexpectedly fun ride this game has been. After a brief tutorial, the game plops you down in the middle of this vast open ocean full of islands and outposts and, most importantly, other players. This game is constantly online and you pretty much always have strangers on the server with you, so there's always a slight tinge of fear when you go treasure hunting that all of what you've gathered today can be pilfered and sold off for someone else's benefit. But that just makes it all the more satisfying when you claim your rewards. Boss fights, giant kraken attacks, fortress raids, throwing your friend in prison when he decides to be an annoying little bitch. This game is just a giant sandbox full of possibilities for pirate adventure. Every person I've spoken to who has played this game has described their own entirely unique stories and experiences, and it might be one of the best cooperative multiplayer games on the market right now. From what I understand, it didn't necessarily start out that way, but now's a better time than any to dive into the Sea of Thieves. This year, I really dove deep into a lot of old titles and Nintendo's lesser-selling franchises like Kirby and Metroid, but none of them stuck out to me as much as Fire Emblem: Genealogy of the Holy War. Fire Emblem is basically chess that tries to guilt you into feeling bad for killing off your pieces. The entire game takes place on a grid, and each character, much like the various pieces in chess, has their own range of movement, as well as their own weapons, stats, and skills. You move or attack with all your units, and then the enemy gets to move and attack, and if your character dies, they're gone for good. I mean, unless you reset back to your previous save. Genealogy of the Holy War really sets itself apart from the other games in the series for a few reasons. Firstly, the story. The game takes place over the course of 2 generations of characters. You start off playing as the first generation, training them, building up their armories, forming relationships between them, and when the second generation rolls around, you play as the children of the first generation's characters. It's really interesting to see how events play out over the course of literal decades of conflict, and many of the antagonists are directly related to your characters by blood, adding extra dramatic weight to their struggles. This game has some of my favorite characters in the series, and each of them has their own unique skills and specialties in gameplay that make them feel truly distinct from one another. Secondly, the maps in this game are massive compared to other games in the series. Instead of having to simply kill the enemy commander or seize a single castle, you're conquering entire countries worth of land. It makes the game's pacing a decent bit slower, but it also makes it feel so grand in scope, like you're really fighting a war that spans an entire continent. It may not have the most well-designed maps or be the most difficult, but it truly felt like something special, and I'm really looking forward to a potential remake. Listen, I enjoyed every game on this list, but maybe with the exception of Genealogy of the Holy War, I wouldn't say I loved any of those games. Saying a game is great feels like an attempt at being objective, but loving a game is something much more emotional and hard to explain. But let me tell you, I loved Yakuza Zero. It's a beat-em-up, action-adventure business simulator with rhythm game and crime drama elements, so it might take me a bit to give you an actual idea of what the game is like. The story follows Kazuma Kiryu and Goro Majima, and alternates between them over the course of the plot, and this is where I think Yakuza Zero really sets itself apart from other narrative-driven games that I've played. Kiryu and Majima are very different people in very similar circumstances. Their lives are constantly being thrown off course by people in greater positions of power than them, but it never feels like they lose their sense of agency in their own lives. Through this parallel narrative, we see their differences exemplified. Kiryu is quiet and stern, but morally uncompromising, often reiterating that he is more willing to die than he is to forsake his ideals. Majima, on the other hand, is charismatic and charming, but surprisingly ruthless in the pursuit of his goals. It is these key traits that they possess that directly bring them into conflict with the rest of the game's characters. All of the supporting characters are amazing too, and all have something to like about them, even the antagonists, who possess this unshakable charisma to them. I know I'm praising the game's story and characters, but ironically, most of your time playing this game isn't even spent on the story itself. Most of the time, you're wandering around the streets of 1980s metropolitan Japan, getting wrapped up in all sorts of silly nonsense. The open world here is pretty small, but it's jam-packed with content. There are 100 different side missions you can find and complete, each with their own somehow simultaneously mundane and ridiculous stories. There are over a dozen different mini-games, from bowling to darts to disco and karaoke rhythm games, which are just the best thing ever. On your way to these places, however, you'll constantly be stopped by thugs on the street, and this is where the fighting comes in, and Man, it's really satisfying. I've never been too much of a fan of beat-em-up games, especially not single-player ones. It's always felt a bit mindless and repetitive to use the same couple of moves over and over again, and unlike in a traditional fighting game, you're playing against AI, not real people who will adapt to you. Yakuza Zero sidesteps this almost entirely by giving both Kiryu and Majima 4 of their own unique fighting styles to work with, and each one is uniquely useful in its own way. For example, Kiryu's rush style is great in boss fights where you can take a shit ton of damage in one hit, so mobility is key. However, in big group fights, switching to beast style lets you knock down multiple opponents at once and pick up random shit off the street to beat people with. Once you've dealt out enough damage, you can use heat actions, which are essentially these super cinematic finishers that use the environment you're in to its fullest. They're pretty brief and to the point, so they don't take you out of the action, but they're incredibly satisfying. The only complaint I have about the combat is that Majima's breaker style is ridiculous. It's by far the best of his fighting styles and trivializes a lot of his fights both on the streets and in the story. It's a minor complaint though, since on its own it's just amazing to watch. The graphics do show their age in some spots, the generic NPC faces especially, but for Kiryu and Majima and a lot of the plot relevant characters, they're all modeled and animate super well. And I know I've said this for most of the games on this list, but the music is fantastic. Each fighting style for Kiryu and Majima has its own theme to go with it, and the boss battles and a lot of the tense moments have amazing music as well. It's just been so long since I've played a game that did so many things I hadn't seen before while still maintaining such a strong personal identity. Every part of it just feels like it has so much creativity pumped into it. It's goofy, but it's also serious. It's realistic, but also fantastical. It surprised me at every turn. And it might just be one of the best games I've ever played.